why are we doing this webinar today? Why, for example, did the Therapeutics Initiative put out a newsletter on tablet splitting just last week? I must say, a week ago when I opened up my email and I read this newsletter, I thought, hey, this is really cool. In the reading and the perusing I do of the literature, this is something that hasn't come across my desk, and yet it's something that we've been doing for years. And this is an interesting guiding document. So I said, we should really have a webinar, and here we are today. But how is the timing of this so important? As you can see here, obviously within COVID-19, and the need to really thinking about trying to limit the number of times patients are leaving their home, going to the pharmacy to pick up prescriptions for refills, the need for physical distancing, the need to meet the needs of patients on quarantine, tablet splitting might be a bit of a solution. The ongoing drug shortage, the potential further drug shortages that we've been experiencing in Canada and in many parts of the world, tablet splitting might be a solution in some situations. We can extend a patient's medication supply, save the patient money, but I think also the importance of thinking about saving the system money, whether the payer be a private drug plan, whether it be our provincial or our state drug plan formularies, whatever it might be, at the end of the day, we're all paying for the medications in one way or another. How do we use our resources appropriately? And finally, we do know for some patients, tablet splitting where drug costs are just so prohibitive for them, a small cost savings might result in them being more adherent to their medication. So now what I'd like to do is put the slides over to Dr. Perry, who has a very interesting, provocative thoughts for us. And he's going to start us out with a pretty cool case.
Thank you, Brenda, and thank you everyone for joining us today. Here you have the relatively standard Canadian case. Many physicians and pharmacists will be familiar with a pattern something like this, and we have often a choice of either doing a proper medication review and thinking about it, or simply writing the prescription or filling the prescription and going about our business. But we have special reasons now to think differently about it. And when we look through that case, in this table, there's one error. Well, I put in ramipril as a tablet thinking it was available in Canada, but it turns out it isn't. But one could have substituted virtually any other antihypertensive drug. And if one did an aggressive splitting or assertive splitting on these tablets, we could save this man $1,300 a year if we deep prescribed duloxetine as well, which he was not finding useful. So this actually, in my experience, is quite representative of what one can do. But as Brenda just told us, we've often had resistance to this because people weren't interested in cost saving if they had a benefit plan that paid for it, or felt, why should I save the government money? In my experience over the last 25 years or so, the people who are interested in pill splitting tend to be those who value public resources or their own personal money. And we may have a reason to be more assertive about this now. This guy can definitely save money, but if you think about what would come next, would there be any harm to him in terms of not only the surrogate outcomes, for example, A1C and type 2 diabetes, but the real outcomes that we're trying to prevent? So I'm going to explore that briefly with some examples. Our colleague in the Therapeutics Initiative, Kate O'Sullivan, has been paying attention to the SGLT2 inhibitors for several years now, and pointed out that in the very influential EMPA-REG outcome trial of empagliflozin versus alternatives to attempt to achieve certain targets in A1C for diabetes, empagliflozin 10 milligrams performed similarly to 25 milligrams. And here you see the major adverse cardiovascular outcomes, which is the primary outcome in that very large experiment. But all-cause mortality has an identical curve. So if you pay attention to this, one would realize that there isn't any known reason to give someone a larger dose with pre-existing high-risk cardiovascular disease compared with a lower dose. And I'm sorry, I'll go back to that. You can see that the tablets can be easily split, and one could save about $550 a year if you settled for a half of the larger tablet, which would be 12.5 milligrams per day. And similarly, with canagliflozin, if we look at the Canvas program, which was that's a brand name, a company name for trials in cardiovascular disease, that canagliflozin at two different, canagliflozin does separate from placebo and is somewhat better than placebo in cardiovascular outcomes, but it does not, in the New England Journal of Medicine publication, show us the two separate doses that were used. And in fact, Health Canada had access to the complete trial data because it's a regulatory agency, and discloses, if you look at the prescribing information, that there wasn't apparently any difference between the 100 and 300 milligram doses. So if we add to that what we can learn from the Credence trial, more recently published in type 2 diabetes with nephropathy, why did the Credence investigators decide to use 100 milligrams rather than 300? It turns out that they felt at the higher dose of canagliflozin, adverse effects were more frequent, and they had no evidence of greater benefit from the cardiovascular trial. So here we have a very, very clear precedent where evidence shows us if we would like to extend pill supply, if there were a shortage, or if we simply want to save money for whoever is paying for it, splitting the pill would work very nicely. And one could either split the 300 milligram pill in half, or split it in thirds if one wanted, and use 100 milligrams, the dose used in the renal outcome trial. So now let's turn to antihypertensive drugs. I'm going to give you two examples. The first one is ramipril, coming from our case, as one example of an ACE inhibitor. And one can say the same thing about all ACE inhibitors and all ARBs. And you have there the reference, if you're curious about this, to look at the Cochrane review. But you can see on the left-hand side that doses of 5 and 10 milligrams do lower blood pressure a little bit more than 1.25 or 2.5. 20 milligrams actually was not reported in dose-finding trials. But if you look on the right, I've put in a pinkish color the panel that shows us really you get the largest effect at 5 milligrams per day. So for if one can hold on to this lesson and think of any ACE inhibitor or ARB that can be conveniently split, if you start with a large pill and cut it into pieces, you're probably going to get the same or very close to the same blood pressure lowering effect. No one can tell us whether the ultimate outcome of cardiovascular disease follows the same pattern, but we don't have any reason to believe that higher doses give us better results for the clinical outcomes than for the surrogate. If we look at thiazides, we do have a little bit of evidence on that. On the left, you see for thiazides and thiazide-like diuretics, including indapamide, at the kind of middle range of the human dose range, one gets pretty much the maximum blood pressure effect, shown there in pink. And if we look at the right-hand panel, if we look at total death, there's no difference. Total cardiovascular problems, there's no difference. I've highlighted that just because that's a much larger number of events and it's a more precise estimate. And for coronary heart disease, it's possible that it actually looks like lower doses are better than higher doses, although it's not statistically significant. So the general message there is that with blood pressure drugs, and that includes other classes of blood pressure drugs, there's no need really to go to the higher doses in the average patient to accomplish maximal blood pressure lowering. With statins, this is even more crystal clear. This has been known since the 1990s. With every statin as part of the marketing, one develops a more potent drug and then you compare it against others. And in fact, the vast majority of the cholesterol lowering effect occurs at the lower end of the dose range. As you go up, you get a little bit more, but proportionately remarkably little. It's much harder to tell from evidence whether there is a different effect on the real clinical outcomes. Somebody there needs to mute the microphone, please. But when we looked at this in the therapeutics letter, the reference at the bottom here, we found that for death, there's no difference between high and low doses. For non-fatal MI, the high dose does perform a little bit better. The absolute risk reduction would be 1.2%. So 12 out of every 1,000 people could avoid a non-fatal MI if they're taking a statin and use a larger dose. But for total serious adverse events, which is a measure of all of the bad things, seriously bad things that happen to people, no difference. So one can conclude what one wants from that, but shall we say if there were a shortage of statin and several million Canadians fighting over them, we might well split the pills and let everybody have some and not get too freaked out about it. Now let's look at antidepressants. This is a much more complicated issue. When I set out to prepare a slide, I thought maybe I can get you some nice numbers, but after spending a few hours on it on the weekend, I threw in the towel and decided to simply give you some common sense. For mortality and depression, which includes suicide, basically we don't know much of anything about any dose. For remission, generally we have very little information, or it's very unclear what it means. For response, pretty much the same. On the other hand, for adverse effects, they're always significantly worse at higher doses. And one can see that very easily by looking at any product monograph. If you're curious about this, I recommend to you venlafaxine or mirtazapine or quetiapine as good product monographs that have very nice tables. And it's quite easy to see that toxicity is dose dependent. So what if we were to extend this and try to go a little bit further? You see on the left, we've got a very assertive provincial health officer in BC, and I haven't been shopping now for about 3 weeks. So the last time I was out, I laid in what I thought would be at least a 2-week supply of milk, scotch, and orange juice. And my wife was particularly assertive in rationing the scotch. Not that she likes it, she just didn't want me to go back out shopping again. So I've had to divide it and take a small portion of each of those at a time. And on the right, you see esomeprazole. This picture was taken in 2002 when esomeprazole cost about $2.20 for 40 milligram tablet, which was a huge amount of proton pump inhibitor. But if one were to split it, one would still have a huge amount of proton pump inhibitor in each one of those fragments. And we never published this because we couldn't prove from a controlled trial what I'm about to show you, but I'm going to walk you in a moment through a rational argument why one might want to do that. And here's the story, the way it came down when Nexium, the original brand name, was evergreened or remarketed from the original racemic drug, omeprazole, which has both the S and the R left and the right forms. The price was $2.20 no matter which tablet size. The coating was intended to protect the tablet from hydrolysis of the active drug in the stomach. And we were told you cannot split it. And when I tried writing prescriptions for people to split esomeprazole, they were uniformly told at the dispensing pharmacy, you must not do that, you'll ruin it. So they always came back and said, I was told I can't do that. And we know this about the clinical pharmacology. This drug, like all proton pump inhibitors, is an extremely potent inhibitor of stomach acid secretion from parietal cells. We knew already that it was rapidly absorbed from aqueous solution when the company did its PK pharmacokinetic trials. And we know from various reviews, including US Food and Drug Administration reviews, that higher doses very seldom work better clinically than lower doses, particularly for acid reflux. And the reason for that is partly that acid reflux is not exclusively acid, it's also other stomach contents. But if we look in a bit more detail at the kinetics, on the left, you see here a graph published by Astra scientists very early on, showing their experiments to prove that esomeprazole would be absorbed and that it would stay in the plasma at a higher concentration than the other stereoisomer, R-omeprazole. And you can see that they peak very, very fast. On this scale, it's going to be at around 1/2 hour. This is an aqueous solution of esomeprazole given to volunteers dissolved in water. Now, in fact, they also gave it with bicarbonate to protect it from stomach acid. I'm not smart enough to figure out how much the bicarbonate buffer would have changed stomach pH. But if you allow yourself to think, imagine that quarter of an esomeprazole sitting in the stomach. What you really want is to get it into the small bowel before it's destroyed. What if you've already taken a full tablet and markedly elevated the pH of the stomach, made it more alkaline than it normally is? And what if you now chase the fragment down with a full glass of water? I'm going to leave you to think about that yourselves, but I certainly answered this question myself by splitting tablets when I once took a proton pump inhibitor for heartburn. So what about some other ones? Here's one, our colleague Keto Sullivan submitted the question about vortioxetine. I'm not recommending this drug. I think there's strong reasons not to prescribe it, but if you were using it, could you split large tablets since it's expensive? And are the tablets fabricated in such a way as to make you think that you couldn't? Well, in fact, you can with a nice pill splitter like the one shown here. And obviously, statins are easy to split. Nadolol in one version, that's one of the original commercial versions, was scored. Chlorthalidone is scored. And plasgliflozin is not scored, but also easy to split. And it doesn't have any protective coatings. And I think cyclobenzaprine is a nice example because Aaron Tajani, who introduced the webinar today, looked at this a few years ago, and we took a careful look at cyclobenzaprine, a drug that many doctors and probably pharmacists have long felt is overprescribed, perhaps shouldn't be prescribed at all. Turns out it's definitely being prescribed in excessive doses very frequently in British Columbia. There's a clear dose response for toxicity. And we concluded if you're ever going to prescribe it, why not start with split tablets, take a small dose, or preferably none. And you can see that you can split it safely. And in fact, the original full houses can be split. Most people will know this is often referred to as the little house pill. So looking at what could this amount to in British Columbia, supposing we actually were serious about cost saving, worried about deficits and how the government can continue to pay for hospitals and schools in the future and poverty reduction. I took these out of a table of some of the most expensive 100 drugs in British Columbia. The top ones are biologicals and an entirely different subject, but amongst the top 100 are these drugs, which could quite easily be split. In green, I've shown the ones that have generic equivalents, which are less expensive to start with. But even if one were to, for example, substitute generic esomeprazole for brand name Nexium and split tablets, the total amount of money saved in British Columbia last year would have been $6.7 million on the ingredients. That would be primarily individual patients or private benefit plans that would have saved the money, but it still would have been available for some more useful purpose. And if you think about your own situation, there will be similar examples anywhere in the world probably. So what about pills that we've been told we cannot split? I think we made the mistake of putting warfarin into our letter. And then as I was preparing this presentation, I remembered that's crazy. I've got patients who split warfarin. I've got one who has been taking 6.5 milligrams a day recently. And of course, this is an old practice to split warfarin. In fact, a careful prescriber or dispensing pharmacist who handles anticoagulation will be familiar with that. What about controlled release or other anti-epileptic drugs? What about L-Dopa, carbidopa, or pills that crumble easily? One of the pharmacists in British Columbia, Brenda Dick, pointed out that that could be an issue. And you can see candesartan, 16 milligrams, crumbles a little bit, but I think I've shown you already that we don't need to obsess about the tiny little dust particles there. We can either eat them if we wish, or we can throw them away and it won't make any difference to our blood pressure. So I'm going to show you one quick example here of a tablet where, in this case, the references were to the Merck brand Cinemet, which is no longer being made in Canada, but purely for illustration. The United Kingdom's Medicines Organization recommends you can't split it. The BC pharmacists in 2011 said we should not split it and pointed out that at that time they were no longer available scored. The Cleveland Clinic says don't split unless directed to do so by your doctor. I'm not sure what that means, but if we think a little bit and just go beyond what we're told, if you now look at the bottom right table there, if we were to take immediate release L-dopa carbidopa, whether Cinemet brand or another, the time to maximum concentration is very fast, and at an equivalent dose, it reaches a higher maximum concentration than the slow release. And it also achieves a lower minimum. So if one is worried about fluctuations in Parkinson's disease, the slow release drug may be a better option, which is one reason they're popular. However, what if we were to split the slow release? Aren't we going to be at least somewhere in between those two? And what if there are significant clinical fluctuations and then we take a smaller portion of a slow release drug more frequently? So long as we're not paying a ridiculous price for the slow release, it could easily make sense if you think it through kinetically and dynamically. And I think really this, what I'm arguing is a plea for those of us who are, particularly probably the pharmacists who pride themselves on understanding pharmacokinetics more than most doctors. Think a little bit about what we've been trained to believe and whether it's actually all true. Here's some other examples. What about bupropion as well, Butrin XL or similar? Morphine slow release as Tiva, which I think is also known as Meslan, is for some reason in Canada available in a scored tablet only at 200 milligrams, and that should be used only with people who are already quite tolerant of opioids. But if it's formulated similarly, is there a scientific reason why you could split at 200 and not a 100? And if there were a major price advantage and a reliable patient, wouldn't one want to think about that? And with carbidopa, with L-dopa carbidopa, here's an APO brand, which is in fact still scored. I'm not sure if this is available. I found these images on the internet. Well, I'm just going to walk you through one other just challenging idea with bupropion extra long release, or XL, whatever XL stands for. If you look at the product monograph, it tells you you should never split. But you can also learn that at page 16 out of 45 of the Canadian monograph, easily available online, it warns us there is some incidence of seizures. It's not really clear what incidence means, so I put that in quotation marks, but some fraction of people taking this drug do have seizures. At a higher dose, it's substantially higher. With the immediate release formulation, even at lower doses, it seemed to be higher, which is an argument for making it slower release to avoid peaks, very high peaks in concentration. And at very high doses, the seizure risk is said to be almost 10-fold higher. So I don't know about you who are listening, but I've certainly seen records for many patients who get pushed in British Columbia to 450 milligrams per day, which is 50% higher than the maximum approved dose in Canada. And I wonder whether people are even aware of this. But if we think a little bit further about the kinetics, take a look quickly at the right side panel there, those three graphs. This comes from what I've called it a non-scientific pharmacokinetic schematic, otherwise known as propaganda. If you're curious about this and look up the reference, I think you'll agree with me. This is written apparently by a prominent psychiatrist, but probably ghostwritten and rather nonsensical. It's open access, easy to find, but it suggests that somehow the XL, which is the bottom right, is a better pattern. But if you look at it yourself, is it actually really better than taking slow-release bupropion twice a day? Or is it even all that much better than the IR formulation taken 3 times a day? I'm not sure what this was actually supposed to mean. If we go to the left and think about what is known about the kinetics, they're highly variable between individuals. The elimination half-life for bupropion is said to be on average somewhere between 12 and 30 hours. Its active metabolite hydroxybupropion around 22 hours. Because hydroxybupropion accumulates, about something like over 80% of the total exposure to a pharmacological effect is from hydroxybupropion. And with a drug that has a 22-hour elimination half-life, if you had slightly faster release from a split slow-release tablet, would it really make any difference when you already have a lot in your bloodstream? I don't find that logical. If we get time for questions, perhaps people will ask about this. And if anyone finds a flaw in the reasoning, I'd love to know it if you follow up with me by email. So I think we're going to go back to Brenda now. We're doing well for time, Brenda.
Okay, good. I'll keep it brief because I want to make sure we do have time for discussion from the chat. But I wanted to just sort of end up the webinar with some just practical considerations with respect to tablet splitting. I think Tom's case at the beginning really gave a compelling thought process for a patient that was on lots of medications, how there could be quite a cost savings for the patient if there's some tablet splitting going on. But if we do this, I think the key thing I feel as a pharmacist who's worked in primary care, with a little bit of experience in community, that we need to do it safe. Do it in a safe way. And by that, I mean we need the prescriber, the pharmacist, and the patient all to be on the same page. We need clear communication amongst the different parts of the process. So it just goes back to the basics that we know about a good prescription is written with the drug name, the drug, what strength of tablet is wanted, what dose is wanted for the patient, the route, and the frequency. This is pharmacist or physician prescribing 101. Good practice would also include the purpose of the prescription. What is it for? But this prescription, as I'm showing here, is an example of how the prescriber could make it clear to the pharmacist that the idea of give this patient 32 milligram candesartan, and let's give them a half tablet for a dose of 60 milligrams, a half a tablet once daily. The prescriber can indicate in the quantity that they want the patient to receive, in this case, 30 tablets, which would actually, instead of being a 1 month supply, would be 2 months because it's just a half a tablet once a day, and indicate 6 refills. So that's just basic prescribing, but I wanted to show how that would look when we're talking about a half a tablet. From the pharmacist's perspective, I mean, this is what we do every day. We're going to make sure the prescription label is very clear with instructions with respect to the regulations around it. We'll have all those components, the strength of the tablet, the dose, that it's a half a tablet, how often. And then what I really would like to bring out is that, if it's not a tablet that splits easy, the pharmacist could certainly provide the tablet cutter or advise the patient of the tablet cutter available for purchase so that patients can take some responsibility and cut the tablet themselves. I feel we just briefly to say that we need the patients to take ownership of all of this as well. They can cut the tablet. They need to keep a very clear list of what medications they're on. It should be updated all the time. It have the name, the strength, the dose that they're on, the frequency, and if they know how long they're supposed to be on it, indicate that as well. We need patients to carry that information so that everyone can be on the same page. Next slide. Tablet splitting in the real world, I just want to briefly visit this. As I mentioned, the pharmacist will be guided to prescribe, to write on the label the prescriber's instructions, as I mentioned, the drug name, the strength, the dose, the route, the frequency. But I just want to bring to the attention that the amount that the pharmacist actually provides, the quantity, the number of months supply, this, pharmacists know this, but some may not on the webinar, there will be provincial rules or regulations that govern how many months supply a pharmacist can, a patient can receive at a time. This may vary from province to province across Canada, and this will be guided by contracts the pharmacist has signed with the government. So just quickly as an example, in Saskatchewan, in our province, most prescriptions are given a 1 month supply, but through our regulations and our contract with the government, there are certain medications that patients that are stabilized and on chronic therapy, the pharmacist is what's the word I'm looking for? The pharmacist is told through the contract to provide a 3 month supply of these specific medications as shown on the slide. So thyroid medications, anticonvulsants, and diuretics. The pharmacist in those situations would give a 3 month supply. But two exceptions to all this, and there's going to be differences across the country. Right now with the COVID-19 pandemic, the Canadian Pharmacists Association has spoken to the membership, to pharmacists across the country to say, you know, we don't want patients hoarding medications. We don't want them to have extra supplies in their home. We're having shortages already, and we anticipate that there will be more shortages. So the general recommendations out to pharmacists across the country right now is as much as possible, we should be actually limiting the supply that we give patients to a 1 month supply. Now, with all of this that I've just said, with all of this, the pharmacist will use their professional judgment and can make adjustments to be giving more than what they might usually or less than they might usually to best meet the needs of the patients. And this can come up in the discussion later, but I just wanted to bring that up as a heads up. Next slide. For those that may not be aware, Tom's shown already, this is what a tablet cutter looks like. Many medications, you don't need to use a tablet cutter, readily available in pharmacies, $6. The patient will put the tablet in it, bring the lid down, and it will split the tablet in half. Especially useful if the tablet is not scored. As I said before, more scored tablets, you can press your thumb down on them and they'll split very easily. But the key thing in this, Tom, just go back, one key point I really want to make in all of this for the prescribers, and my message obviously to the pharmacists and to the public, is that really we need patients to take charge of tablet splitting whenever possible. It's not good use of pharmacist or pharmacy technician resources to be taking responsibility to be splitting everyone's tablet. They just don't have the time to do this. There's other things they need to do that are more important. They will certainly in select situations, and they do commonly for patients that can't do it themselves because of cognition or arthritis, for example, but let's encourage patients to buy these when needed, to split the tablets themselves, and if needed, buy a tablet splitter. Next slide. I want to just bring up one more point as it relates to everything that's been said already. There are drugs on the market that have what we call flat pricing. So if you look, for example, in this table, I've shown it just a couple examples with the angiotensin receptor blockers and the beta blockers. If you look at valsartan as one example, the 80 milligram lower dose is 20 cents a tablet. The higher dose price, 160 milligrams, is 20 cents as well. So when we look at cost savings opportunities, if we prescribe valsartan 160 milligrams, the dose is 80 milligrams, a half a tablet, that has potential to save the system, the patient, money. Here's some more examples for you to take away, but there's many examples like this. Next slide. So just to wrap up a bit, to sort of highlight what Tom said, tablet splitting, yeah, we can do this. We've done it for years. There is some cautions, there's some common sense we need to think about when it might not be a good idea. And I've mentioned already the patient factors. You know, maybe a patient that's really unstable, whether it be medically or with mental health conditions, maybe this is not the most important fish to fry today with them. Maybe they're not able cognitively, maybe they're not able to manipulate it, or maybe they're just not interested. Perhaps with narrow therapeutic index drugs, we should be somewhat cautious about tablet splitting, but Tom said it already. I mean, we split warfarin tablets all the time and they come scored. But situations where it's really imperative that the full dose be given, maybe tablet splitting is not good. Anticoagulants are newer direct oral anticoagulants like dabigatran, apixaban, rivaroxaban. Chemotherapeutic agents, birth control pills, perhaps anti-epileptics. They have a certain therapeutic range we're aiming for. Maybe we don't want to split them all the time. Corticosteroids for adrenal insufficiency or steroid-dependent patients. That's a general thought, but I will definitely say, right now I have a patient who's been on high-dose prednisone for years, and we're tapering them off. And we are definitely going to be using a tablet cutter to split their dose as we get down to that smaller part of the tapering piece. Perhaps antibiotics to antivirals. We've mentioned already fragile pills that really crumble, not just like Tom showed where there's a few little dust specks left, but when they really crumble, maybe for sure that's not a good situation to be cutting. Modified release form products, we need to be cautious. The best example I can think of is our 5-ASA products for inflammatory bowel disease, where they're formulated to get the drug to a specific site of action. Probably not a good idea. So let's move on. I would like to sort of finish off by saying a little piece about how tablet splitting really fits into situations when we're taking somebody off a medication, doing what we call deprescribing. Many on the webinar may be familiar with the Canadian Deprescribing Network. I really encourage you to check out their website. They have fantastic tools that can assist you when you're looking at tapering or deprescribing a medication for a patient. This tool I use every week in my practice. I have patients that I've got on board to taper off their sleeping medications. And this tool allows me to work with them to give them a pictogram where they can self-manage their own tapering schedule by following the plan on this tapering schedule. This is an evidence-based tool that's been proven through the Empower trial that patients can do it. And these types of tools make this process easy, and certainly pill splitting comes into this type of initiative. I'd be happy or Cami will take more questions at the end. Next slide. So to sort of wrap up to my previous slide, Tom, can you go back 3? I just wanted to finish up by saying tablet splitting done wisely. I wanted to pick up on the choose wisely theme. Let's consider this. Tom's given us lots of good things to think about. Let's consider tablet splitting to stretch prescriptions, potentially save patient money. Let's use tablet splitting as a means to consider conserving medications for others who need them more, or for others who need them. And this is the issue around the pills, the tablets, and the medication supply problems that we're having and that we might be having more so in the future. Obviously, consider it for financial reasons. Really make sure it's a patient-led initiative whenever possible. Patients should be taken responsible for splitting them. We want to conserve the pharmacist's resources. We don't want them spending all their time splitting tablets all day. We want them to do good patient care. We want to do it in a way, we want to keep it safe. I hope I've made that clear with the need for clear instructions. And let's keep it simple. We can use tablet splitting as a way to make the deprescribing process simple and use tools that exist, as I've just mentioned to you, to help taper patients off medications when appropriate. So with that, I'd like to just start a discussion. I'd like to remind you, I think I've mentioned it at the beginning, but the Therapeutics Initiative really has published an amazing newsletter on this topic. I encourage you to share it with your colleagues. I encourage you to share this webinar with your colleagues and have a discussion around this. Next slide. So let's finish up, and I'll ask Erin to sort of turn to you and to guide us through the questions that we've been getting from the audience on this great topic.
Great. Thanks, Brenda and Tom. A great webinar. We have just over 15 minutes, and Brenda and Tom, to give you an idea, I've probably got about 20 questions in the chat. So it's possible we can get through all of them if we keep the answers brief. And a reminder, complete your evaluations, submit them, and then within several days, you'll get your CME credits, and the webinar will be posted on the website within hours, I believe, after the end. Okay, so let's get started. The first question was, can sustained release tablets be split? And I know that's been covered, and it's probably drug dependent, but there are some more questions related to bupropion that we'll get to in a second. There's a comment from one of our patient representatives that said it's not always the cost that's the motivating factor or resistance to splitting. It's the relationship with the prescriber and the belief in the the efficacy or the evidence around a drug. So the challenge for pill splitting care provider is to empower the patient by building trust and sharing knowledge. If Tom or Brenda, do you have any comments related to that?
It's Tom Perry here. I think to have the ability to engender that kind of confidence, it helps if you know your drugs reasonably well. And the solution to that for doctors or other prescribers is don't use too many drugs. Whatever you decide as your formulary, but probably in primary care and in most specialties, it certainly shouldn't be more than 50 drugs. I think mine in internal medicine and high blood pressure and pain are probably less than 20 drugs. And I would look up a drug if it's outside of that 20. That's the way you get trust, is knowing what you're doing.
Mm-hmm. I would just like to add, I think that comment from the member of the public is very insightful, and obviously something that many healthcare providers can certainly relate to in other patients. So I appreciate that comment. I think it's a really good reflection and an important point that really underpins all the things that we do, that patients and providers together have to work, trust one another, and feel that we're working together for the best outcome of that individual. And that means about making plans and tailoring them to the individual in front of them. So I really appreciate that comment. And I think just to take it another little piece, that, you know, obviously the patient has to feel that if they're going to get in, let's talk about specifically pill splitting, if the patient's going to buy in and want to do that, they have to believe that it's worthwhile doing. They have to have a sense that it's valuable to them or to society. And really, you know, for certain medications where they're just so darn cheap to start with, and there's not many of them, but when medications are around $15 to $18, whether you take the 10 or the 20 and you split them, there really might not be a big difference in the price to the consumer in that situation, because a good percentage of the drug cost is related to the professional services of the pharmacist to review that medication, ensure there's no drug interactions, select the product, dispense it, and provide that service to educate the patient. So not to be long-winded, but I think there's a few really important points that are made there.
Okay, great. The next few questions are, I'll couple them together. They're all around the practical aspects of actually splitting the tablets. So for example, how do you cut a tablet into thirds? Are there any medications that should never be split? Where do you get tablet cutters? Can you get them online? And if the tablet shape is not regular, how can the patient split it up?
Okay. Tom, maybe I'll take the first kick at this one. Lots of pharmaceutical questions there. So I'll start with the tablet cutter to start with. So in several pharmacies, many pharmacies might sell them in the front of the store where they sell their dosettes. So you may be able to find it at the front of a store and select it for yourself. If you don't see it there, check with the pharmacy team. And if they have it, they'll be able to show it to you. There is a chance that they may have it behind the counter. Not likely, it's usually out front, or they could certainly order it for you if they don't have one. But remember, again, not all tablets need to be split with a tablet cutter. If it's scored, you might do just fine with a little steak knife with your thumb pressing down on the tablet. But for things that are not scored, certainly tablet cutters can be helpful. They're inexpensive, $6 available through pharmacy. I wanted to address the shape of the tablets. It was sort of alluded to already. For example, really odd shaped tablets, if you can line it up and cut through the middle and feel that it's a reasonable half split, that's reasonable. Aaron, can you remind me, there was a couple other sub-questions?
I'm going to jump in there for a second because one of the purposes I hope we accomplish in this webinar is to get people thinking independently. And if you think about the size of different individual human beings, in pediatrics we adjust for weight, at least in very small humans, but once they get past young childhood, everybody gets the same dose. Now, does that make sense? If everybody can manage with the same dose, that it would make a tremendous difference if you cut a pill in half and you ended up getting 60% one day and 40% the other. Or if you try to cut it into thirds and you actually end up with 25, 25, and 50, can it really make a difference? I don't think so biologically. Even the same individual will achieve different concentrations if they take the same pill on different days. And some drugs are better absorbed with food and others are less well absorbed with food. And there's just a huge amount of variability, so that it probably makes essentially no difference as long as the drug isn't destroyed somehow by cutting it.
Okay, and then the one other thing was the splitting tablets in thirds. Any suggestions for?
That relates to the issue of cutting something in thirds. I mean, it really doesn't matter if it's close to 1/3, exactly 4/12, or what if it's 3/12 or 5/16
Okay.
or something like that. Those of us who hated doing fractions in elementary school, let's obsess about it a little bit less. And by the way,
Okay.
you can get pill splitters online. Just check it. One last thing, if you understand elimination half-life, it'll help you. And many drugs are actually quite long elimination half-lives. You can find that very easily in a simple internet search. For example, mirtazapine half-life. It doesn't really matter if it's 27 hours or 20 hours or 34 hours. It tells you when you swallow one day, there's a lot of it the next day. Would it really matter if you didn't get, what if they cut you short on a tablet and they gave you one that had only 95% as much in it? Would you go take it back and insist on the full 100? I don't think so.
The next comment, thank you both for those answers, was some tablet strengths are covered, whereas some larger tablet strengths are not. I think even most candesartan 32 milligram strengths are not covered, whereas the 8 and the 16 milligrams are.
Yeah, so Aaron, that's a very good comment. And so I always consider, you're absolutely correct. There is some situations, not many, is in my clinical experience, where some tablet strengths are not covered under provincial formulary. And if my patient gets benefits under the provincial formularies, I need to obviously be considering that.
Sure.
It's not common, but that is a reasonable point to bring up.
Okay, thank you. A couple of people had wanted to go over the bupropion, Cinemet CR, Nexium splitting again, just for clarification. For example, those graphs you showed, Tom, for bupropion. So could you maybe summarize the reasons for it being okay to split these controlled release or so-called controlled release formulations?
Yes, and I think in the first case, the proton pump inhibitors. What if it's true that the drug is hydrolyzed or destroyed by strong acid in the stomach? The company AstraZeneca in that case wouldn't tell us that if they hadn't been worried about it ruining the drug. So when they gave it to human volunteers, they froze esomeprazole in water and stored it as a solution, frozen solution. They thawed it. They gave it to people preceded by a little bit of sodium bicarbonate to reduce the acidity of the stomach, and then chased or followed by some more sodium bicarbonate. Now, you could do that yourself if you were obsessive, but what if you just take the pill fragment, which is still a kind of a hunk, you swallow it with a big glass of water, and you take some more water to chase it out of your stomach into your duodenum. The duodenum is alkaline. So is there anyone who seriously believes all of it is going to be destroyed in the stomach before it gets into your bloodstream? And I guess, to know that absolutely scientifically, we would have to repeat that experiment. If there are any of you who are university pharmacists who have a lab where you can assay a proton pump inhibitor, it would be a pretty easy experiment to do. And I don't think there's much question that one would show enough of it is absorbed to have a powerful effect. But if you were really worried about it, the logic would be to take a complete tablet the first time, knock out your stomach acid for the 24 hours or so that it lasts, and then fragment it after that. And unfortunately, I can't refer you to a publication because it would not have been in the company's interest to do that kind of study. And so far as I know, no one else has bothered. With respect to bupropion, we can't tell you, oh, look, here's an experiment. Similarly, we can't tell you, here's an experiment in which people have split bupropion, showed that it's perfectly safe. This is one where one has to use one's own mind a little bit. Supposing bupropion were a life-saving drug, we had a shortage and we only had 100 tablets of 300 milligrams, but we had 10 people to treat. Do we really think we wouldn't consider splitting the tablet and letting everybody have some of it?
Sound's going again.
And I think with the Sinemet, anyone who's treated Parkinson's disease will know that as it gets worse, the fluctuations in motor response can be terrible. It becomes a hugely difficult issue for a neurologist or any other physician to deal with, and for the patient to try to get unfrozen and then not get dyskinesia. But that is also telling us about what's going on in the brain in the dopaminergic neurons, and the idea that a small difference in the timing of the peak concentration dependent on and somehow wrecking the characteristics of a pill, I just don't find that plausible. So I think, again, if there were compelling reason financially for someone to split, I wouldn't personally be afraid of it. If people find evidence that we're wrong about that, please let me know by email and we'll correct it in a published comment.
Sorry, we've got about 5 minutes left, so I'll try to breeze through some of the questions quickly. Are there any concerns about pre-splitting tablets or doing it fresh, in quotations, at home? Is there any risk of degradation of a bunch of tablets split ahead of time?
I don't know if you've had any opportunity to look into that issue. That's not something that I'm familiar with. I do understand what the question is and where it's coming from. I do know in the real world, tablet splitting in advance of the drug being given is done very, very commonly in community practice. So, for example, one of the more common ones might be for patients that get their pills packaged in bubble packs in a pharmacy, let's say sent to a nursing home, or for patients that have a bubble pack in their home, it wouldn't be uncommon that there'll be situations where there'll be split tablets put in a bubble pack and sent to a patient with a 1-month supply. So it is something that is done. And off the top of my head, I can't think of any particular tablets that are jumping to mind where we might be saying, oh, we shouldn't be doing that. But if anybody on the line wants to type in an example of something they can think of, but nothing's coming to my mind.
Okay.
It's a bit out of my field, but I'd be much more worried about temperature extremes or possibly humidity extremes. I know I'm going to take the chance to thank Dr. Alexandre Calandrini in Brazil, who looked like he's participating in or listening in on the webinar and has translated into Portuguese the therapeutics letter that Brenda likes so much. In a climate in Northeast Brazil, I'd be more worried about pill stability from those factors.
The next comment, can you comment on removing, I guess, beads or pellets from capsules to get part dose? Example, a duloxetine capsule, a venlafaxine capsule. Is that okay? So if a capsule contains smaller little capsules or tablets within it.
So I'll just make one comment. I mean, in general, in my practice, my more pharmacist self, it would be rare for me to ever have anyone open up a capsule. I think I did it once in a patient who was very able to do it when we were doing a taper and there was a need to sort of slow down the taper. And it was a very unique situation. I can't even remember the medication right now. So for myself, that's not something that I've done. One can think about, just thinking about dosage form design, about, little beads in a capsule, opening it up and making a general pragmatic approach to try to divide the dose for a special situation that could be done as long as the patient swallows the beads whole, without chewing them, etc. But I don't have evidence around that, but that's just using my pharmacist common sense. Tom?
Yeah, interestingly, in the English version of the special edition therapeutics letter, a retired psychiatrist sent in a comment a few days ago pointing out that he had commonly split venlafaxine capsules, both regular and slow release venlafaxine, to help people taper off of that. That's a particularly difficult drug to withdraw from, and a very high probability of developing a pharmacological dependency and withdrawal syndrome from that particular antidepressant. And people have a devil of a time getting off of it. So this psychiatrist points out he has quite frequently done that when he gets to the lowest dose, which in Canada is 37.5 milligrams. I've done it occasionally to demonstrate to patients, and I don't think we have any reason to believe that if you either waste half of the capsule or you put half of the capsule aside into a paper envelope or someplace where you won't lose it, and then just put it on your tongue the next day, it probably works just fine. It might tend to convert it into a faster absorbed drug, but it's
I'm going to
probably not.
interrupt. I'm sorry about that, Tom and Brenda. It's 4:59 before the line closes or people leave. I wanted to say thank you to the speakers and thank you to everyone for taking the time spending with us this afternoon. We really appreciate it. Please stay in touch with the Therapeutics Initiative and have a good evening.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.